Okay, everybody, welcome to our presentation. It's called Mo Prisons, Mo Problems. So, the problem, unfair prison labor conditions. So, corporations and the federal government are benefiting from prison labor, obviously. Prisoners are not being paid, the labor is unregulated, and inmates have very little to gain from the system as it currently stands. The solution, a minimum wage. So, the 13th Amendment currently limits wages for prisoners. Corporations have seen this as an opportunity and have employed prisoners free of charge to work for their organizations. So the prisoners remain poor, the corporations benefit, but installing a minimum wage would change that. So let's look at the local knowledge we have here. All right, prisoners. They provide insight to prison structures. Obviously, their perspective comes from that of somebody who is in prison. Um, Their perspective is also coming from somebody who has no access to the government. So outside of them being tested in the court system, once you're a felon, you can't vote. So they are not represented in government at all. A lot of the people who are in prison are marginalized, uneducated, poor, LGBT people. So they're not weird. Outside knowledge. These are the weird ones. So the 13th Amendment, like I mentioned previously, is something that a lot of scholars and researchers look into when they start looking at prison labor because it's what allows the federal government to not pay prisoners. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So that means that if you're a felon, the government doesn't have to pay you to work and they can still make you work. Researchers have also looked into how prison labor doesn't directly affect recidivism. So recidivism is the study of prisoners leaving prison and then winding back up in prison and just kind of analyzing that cycle of factors that lead them to come back to prison. And the start of the prison labor system as it currently stands was created to kind of decrease recidivism in around 1979, but none of the data says that it's affected recidivism at all. So there's that. Outsider knowledge also comes from the perspective of blue collar workers who are upset about the lack of economic opportunity that they have. But the lack of economic opportunity for these people has been blamed a lot on immigrants or outsourcing, when in reality it's low cost prison labor. So corporations are turning to prisoners instead of free American people because it's more cost effective, because prisoners make a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the federal wage, whereas a free laborer would have to make at least $7 an hour. Also, the current prison system hurts the economy, like I said, paying prisoners or not paying prisoners. Obviously, those prisoners have no money to spend, and people who are not in prison don't have money from the job because it's going to prisoners. And running and keeping up with prisons is devastating for the U.S. economy. It costs billions every year. Power structure and agency. My, look at all those bullet points. So, felons have no social clout, which just means that, like, they're outcasts in society. Prisons are separated from the majority of popular public spaces, and that's on purpose. U.S. felons cannot vote at all, which means that structurally they can't take part in the government. They can't enforce change if, one president, one governor is being particularly unjust to prisoners, then, felons don't get to have a say in that. Like I said, prison structures have very limited visibility. The 13th Amendment keeps wages non existent because prisons don't have to pay prisoners, so they choose not to because it's cost effective. And when prisoners do get paid, wages go back to the prison and not directly to the inmates. And we'll go more into that in a few bullet points. The federal prison industry program made $500 million in 2016, yet prisoners still aren't being paid. So this data just goes to show that clearly the way this is set up, there is money to give to the prisoners, but the forces that be, there's a power imbalance, so they're not getting that money. Inmates make 20 cents an hour on average if they are being paid, which, like I said, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Government jobs pay more than prison jobs, So there's a constant flow of workers for federal jobs. So there's multiple systems in place for prisoners to work. You can work federally or you can work in the prison. Working in the prison is things like mopping, cleaning, cooking. Working federally is where they get outsourced to places like Starbucks, Whole Foods. And they get paid more. And by getting paid more, that means they make like maybe 40 cents an hour, which is still nothing. And I mean, there are some programs where, like, if you're a welding, for instance, and then they require that you get paid the same amount as an inmate working in welding as somebody who is free working in welding would. But prisons, like this last bullet point says, can keep up to 80% of the money that inmates make. So even if the prisoners do make this money, even if there is a minimum wage, in these specific circumstances, as the system is set up now, the prisoners don't get to keep the money. So the solution analysis. So clearly this is going to be a bottom-up solution and not a top-down solution because the Constitution allows for prisoners not to be paid. But the bottom-up solution needs to be from people with more influence, and that's where the blue-collar workers come in. I think if we can educate if we can get these blue-collar workers on board with trying to get prisoners a minimum wage, then they'd have more say because these blue-collar workers have a vote. They have a voice, and they have more opportunities to be visible than prisoners would. Changing wages ties into the lower middle class who can vote in March, like I said. Wages improve commissary access and recidivism, which are local problems. So commissary in prison is where you can buy things like hair products, food, shower accessories, basic luxuries that you wouldn't even really consider a privilege when you're just living your life at home, but things that prisoners have to buy in the prison. And the Bureau of Prisons has listed on their website how much each of these things cost, and prisoners would have to work for hours upon hours upon hours just to buy, a thing of shampoo or something like that. So clearly there needs to be an increase in wages just so prisoners can live more sensibly in prison, and so they can have money saved up for when they leave prison so they don't have to turn back to criminal activity and end up back in prison again, therefore decreasing recidivism. It also improves the economy, which is a problem for people outside. So if a minimum wage was established for prisoners, then that means that blue-collar workers get more money, have more money to spend. There's less money spent on prisoners because there's less people in prison. All right, a win-win solution for the public. The only person or group affected by this who would really be suffering is corporations, because now they have to pay people. Ooh, boo, tough times. Capitalism is terrible. So ultimately, I would say the solution is a win-win, and it's sustainable because it boosts the economy and everybody wants to have more money. My final point, freedom isn't free. There's a minimum wage. Thank you. Please tune in to my TED Talk.